My name is Phil Kostok. I'm professor in the SPF department, and this cluster is co-convened also by Professor Kalypso Nikolaidis, who unfortunately cannot be here with us. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Karp, professor in comparative politics at Brunel University in the UK. Jeff has published extensively on various topics in political behavior. His research appeared repeatedly in top political science outlets, such as the British Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, and many, many others. His research has been cited more than 9,000 times on Google Scholar, which is absolutely impressive. And so today, Jeff will deliver a talk on gender stereotypes and leadership evaluations in comparative perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in online and we're here as well. Should I sit down? I don't know if it's going to be, maybe it's going to be easier. I don't know. Let me sit down and can you all hear me? Is that, you all good? Okay. Well, let me start off by telling you a little bit about this paper and about the research motivation and how it, I think it addresses some very contemporary issues. The question that I'm trying to address in this paper is the fact is that women have become more prominent in national elections, and with that increasing prominence, there are questions that are raised about the extent to which their gender influences what people think of them, and whether or not these evaluations make any difference in terms of vote choice. Tomorrow is the U.S. presidential election. This could be the first time that Americans have ever voted. The first time that a woman has ever been elected as president of the United States. And there's a very good chance that she will be elected. During the campaign, of course, her gender and her race has become an issue. This is not a paper about Kamala Harris, but I think that you can just think about the example of the presidential election as an example that touches on some of these issues that address in the paper. And specifically, it's a question about gender stereotypes and the extent to which these traits, certain traits tend to be associated with female leaders or politicians, and the extent to which they have an influence in vote choice. There's a large body of literature that suggests that gender bias influences how men and women are evaluated, male and female politicians. And there's some evidence to suggest that the bias may work both for and against women. So there's evidence of a bias, and it could be either positive or negative. And another body of literature tends to focus on gender stereotypes. And this has been around for decades, basically. And the assumption is that men are often viewed as having masculine traits that are associated with things that are important in politics. This includes traits like being tough, aggressive, self-confident, and assertive. So the assumption is that that men who possess masculine traits are better suited for leadership roles, whereas women are commonly assumed to have feminine traits that are less associated with power and conflict. And so these traits might be the extent to which women might be warm, compassionate, people-oriented, gentle, kind, passive, caring, and sensitive. And so the extent to which these stereotypes matter might influence how these leaders and how women are perceived, and might have a potential influence on voting behavior as well. There's another sort of argument that these stereotypes put women in a very difficult position because it creates a no-win situation for them, in that if women appear to be too caring or too kind or too gentle, then that undermines the extent to which they can be perceived as being, a competent and strong leader. But if they appear to be strong, and if they try to assert themselves as being a strong leader or to possess masculine traits, they might suffer a consequence for being for assuming traits that are incompatible with these stereotypes. And you can imagine that, and how this might feed into evaluations of leaders. Now, most of the literature on this has been based on experiments. Predominantly, the vast majority of research on this topic has used experimental designs, which typically rely on fictional politicians, hypothetical politicians, people that they don't have any information about these people. And so this paper takes an alternative approach and uses observational data, real world data, and it focuses on politicians who are extremely well known. So here's an example of a politician, a female prime minister from Finland, Sanna Marin, who reached the apex of power in Finland and was prime minister for 4 years between 2019 and 2023. Now, the photograph, I think the photograph is interesting because it's not what you would typically associate, a prime minister or a political leader looking like this. And it generated, I think it appeared on a Finnish magazine and generated a lot of reactions. And men and women, there's some evidence to suggest that men and women reacted differently to that image. But I think it also helps illustrate this double bind, where if in this case, a woman, a female politician is appearing in a more feminine way, that might undermine their credibility as a political leader. And of course, I mean, there were other examples of her specifically running into problems in the way in which the media covered her. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but she was featured. There was some criticism of her for dancing and showing up at clubs, and there was some videos that were leaked from friends of her dancing at a party or whatever, and this tended to undermine her, and there were accusations that she was using drugs and so forth. Anyway, we can sort of think about many examples, and there are examples of Kamala Harris as well. She has actually not said much at all about her gender or her race, but Donald Trump, her opponent, has said many things, and he's not shy about making statements about her race and that she just decided to be Black. Or she's even been accused, there have been suggestions just as recently as a week ago, and I think Donald Trump just yesterday commented on that they basically calling her a prostitute. And he said, well, it's not me that's calling her a prostitute, but so this stuff is prevalent even with the most visible political figures around. So anyway, I have a series of hypotheses here that are derived from this literature, and one is focused on this gender stereotype literature, and it assumes that male leaders are more likely to be seen as strong and competent, while female leaders are more likely to be seen as compassionate and trustworthy. So that's the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is something about masculinity and leadership, that leaders with masculine traits receive more support than those with feminine traits. And the third hypothesis is this double bind hypothesis, that leaders who do not fit into these gender stereotypes are going to be more disliked. So the extent to which they don't fit into these general stereotypes, they might suffer in terms of how they're evaluated. Not all these hypotheses, by the way, are consistent with one another, so they lead to different predictions. There's a fourth hypothesis that's a gender affinity hypothesis, that women are more likely than men to view female leaders in a positive way, and that this might give them an electoral advantage. And so, so you can think of some of this gender stereotype literature being having negative consequences for female politicians, but there's another body of literature that suggests they have positive consequences. So it's no coincidence, for example, that Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris to be his running mate in 2020. It was perceived as an advantage to have a woman on the ticket. And it was perceived as an advantage by John McCain when he selected Sarah Palin to be his presidential nominee in 2008. And it was also seen as an advantage when Geraldine Ferrara was selected by Walter Mondale. So I don't want to suggest that there's a negative aspect of this and a positive aspect. It can work both ways, and the gender affinity hypothesis, I think, feeds into that positive evaluation, at least with respect to how women might evaluate other women leaders. And then on a negative side, there's a gender bias hypothesis that suggests that maybe voters are just less likely to vote for parties led by women. And certainly you hear this as well with Kamala Harris. There's some doubt about whether her gender would cost her votes, particularly among African-American men, and this has come up in the campaign as well. Okay, are there any questions about, you feel free to interrupt or whatever, you know, this just be informal. If anyone says, hey, wait a second, I don't understand what you're saying here. So in terms of the empirical analysis, so there's different strategies and different ways in which you can address these questions. And again, I just want to point out that the vast majority of studies that have tried to look at this has used basically experimental designs with fictional people. People are not well known. So what I tried to do is select people extremely well known, and so I decided to focus on incumbent or sitting prime ministers, and rather than even leaders of the opposition or party leaders. So it's restricted to basically people who are the most well-known politicians in the country, basically, and that's in a parliamentary system that would be prime ministers. And there's also a reason I'm not looking at presidential candidates or whatever. We can talk about that later. So in basically in searching for data that would allow me to kind of address these questions, I've come up with the following sample of female prime ministers. I think I have 9 countries. I have 14. Do I have 14 or maybe around 14? 13 female prime ministers, 7 of which, the ones at the top, are elected from the center left, and then tried to find a roughly equal number, in this case 6 female prime ministers from the center right. Now, some of these prime ministers have appeared in multiple elections. So Angela Merkel, for example, standing in multiple elections, as is Margaret Thatcher, Helen Clark of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. So some of these people appear multiple times, and I have data from multiple elections. And so what I've done here is I've tried to match these female prime ministers to male prime ministers in the same country, and ideally from the same type of party. Now, it doesn't always match up perfectly, but what I've been able to do is basically pair these female prime ministers with their male counterparts at different time periods. So, for example, take Kevin Rudd, for example. Kevin Rudd of Australia is paired with Julia Gillard of Australia, of the Labour Party, who actually replaced Kevin Rudd in what was called, what was referred to as a coup at the time. She deposed the party leader. So, you know, without going into a lot of detail about these particular individuals, Boris Johnson, for example, is paired with Theresa May. John Major there is paired with Margaret Thatcher. I've paired Schroeder and Helmut Kohl with Angela Merkel, so it allows you to sort of compare Angela Merkel to both a male prime minister on the right and on the left. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Anyway, we can come back to the individuals, but let me give you kind of a discussion about, just a rough discussion about the data. I have data from 31 elections over 3 decades of a 30-year period, covering 9 countries. So we have about 80,000 respondents in total, and these surveys are drawn from election studies. So all of the data, with the exception of some data I'll show you from Italy, are from election studies. These are typically surveyed after the election, I've sort of assembled these together. So it's been somewhat time consuming. In terms of the variables that I use, there's in order to measure what I refer to as popularity, I rely on a measure that's frequently asked in almost every election study, is the extent to which people like or dislike a leader. And these are typically referred to as thermometer ratings, and they often range from on a scale from 0 to 10. So 10 being like, 0 being disliked. Vote choice is of course available in all the election studies. I have it except for Thatcher and Major, and that's actually refers to the likes and dislikes. So we don't have a measure of likes and dislikes for Thatcher and Major going back to the 80s in the UK. So they drop out, and some of these people drop out, or some of the cases drop out in some of the analyses. And in order to measure or test some of those hypotheses about gender stereotypes, and this is where the challenge is to find questions about specific leadership traits. And these were initially developed, there's a discussion about this in the paper, but initially these questions were developed in the American National Election Studies, and luckily they were later copied in a number of different countries. And so typically the most frequently asked questions with respect to leadership traits is a question that asks how trustworthy a particular leader is, or how honest they are, or how much integrity they have. But there are other traits that are also commonly asked about leaders, and they have to do with generally whether they're perceived as being strong leaders. And these traits can be basically divided into so-called masculine traits and feminine traits. And so the literature would tend to argue that strong leadership, or to the extent to which people think that a leader is exhibiting strength, is a masculine trait, as is a question that measures competence. So generally, competence and strength are seen as being masculine. I had here assertive. This is one of the traits that were in the German election studies. They used assertive in one of the studies, and then later shifted to whether or not Angela Merkel was being perceived as strong or weak. And then in terms of feminine traits, typically these revolve around honesty, integrity, and so trustworthiness. It was the most frequently asked trait, and that can be categorized as being a feminine trait. Similarly, empathy or compassion is typically associated in the literature with being a feminine trait. Okay, so that's kind of an idea about the data. Let me just give you some examples. I don't know how much time, because I can skip through some of this. If I don't want to talk too long, because I'm sure there might be questions, but
You're fine.
Okay, I'm good. Okay, so in Australia, and in fact, in the Australian election study, they asked a lot more traits than just these four, but I've selected out four that I use in the analysis, along with popularity based on the likes and dislikes. And so there are different ways in which to test these hypotheses. The gender stereotype hypothesis would just involve like a comparison between whether or not, say, Julia Gillard is being, the prediction would be that she would be perceived as being a trustworthy leader and a compassionate one, with being associated with feminine traits, but not a strong leader or not a competent leader. And so if you were to compare them together, and I don't have the totals here, unfortunately, but you can kind of see generally that Julia actually does quite well compared to Kevin Rudd, and indeed particularly well among women. So there's evidence here to suggest that that women are more likely to evaluate, to give her positive marks on all of these traits, which are perceived as being important for leadership. So there's quite a big gender gap on strength. There's also a gender gap on trustworthiness and competence, as is popularity as well. So women were much more, they gave her much higher marks than the male counterparts. Kevin Rudd, in contrast, men were more likely to see him as a strong leader than women. But there are no other differences there. You can see how his popularity is very low. On average, about a third were viewing him as being popular, I think, on the likes and dislikes scale. This is how I've measured it in this instance. And Julia getting much higher marks. In Britain, if you were to compare May and Johnson, you'd also see that Theresa May benefits from this gender gap, and Boris Johnson does not. So the negative signs indicate that there is a gender gap, but it's reversed. Men being more likely to rate Johnson as higher than women. So there's sort of evidence here to suggest that there is something going on with gender and the gender of the leaders as well, and how people react to that. I've got some data here that I'll just show you that's not included in the analysis from Italy, and I think that Maloney is very interesting in terms of the traits, and we can go into detail about how she's explicitly wants to I think she wants to be referred to in a masculine way. And so there's all sorts of interesting stuff here. These data basically come from a survey that I conducted in February. But there's really not much going on here, and I haven't had a chance to do any real analysis with this. It's not part of the analysis in this paper, but it suggests that you don't see these gender gaps here in Italy like you saw in Britain and in Australia. On all of the marks, if you were to compare Georgia and Mario Draghi, and this is another unique survey because we're actually in the same survey asking respondents to compare the two together, whereas in the other pairs, these are different election studies, different contexts and different years, which is probably not so clear there, but well, at the bottom here. So in Australia, I'm comparing the 2010 election study with the 2013 election study. And in Britain, I'm comparing the 2017 election study with the 2019 election study. And here they're compared together. But you can see, like, overall here, about 60% thought that Giorgia Meloni in February was a strong leader, compared to about 69% giving Mario Draghi, strong leadership. So that's kind of consistent, perhaps, with that gender stereotype literature. On trustworthiness, it's not consistent. She's still perceived as being less trustworthy than Draghi. Compassion, she doesn't have much compassion, but neither does Draghi. On competence, there's a substantial difference on that. And on popularity, Draghi is more popular than Meloni, for some obvious reasons, not least because she represents a smaller party. Okay, so here's some results based on this analysis of all of these 80,000 respondents across all of these election studies, where I have data for on traits for these leaders. So I believe I'm missing traits. I think I mentioned it earlier in an earlier slide, but we don't have them from Finland and Iceland and Norway. So some of the Scandinavian countries, we don't have the traits. But so these come from all the other countries. But you can see just generally two things I think just kind of pop out here. One is that women leaders, women prime ministers, are seen as being stronger than men by both men and women. So I think this undermines this stereotype argument that women are not perceived as being strong leaders. And we could talk about this, and maybe this is deliberate. Maybe this is that the female leaders are in fact going out of their way to, like Giorgia Meloni, to appear strong and so forth.
May I just ask you, is this purely descriptive? Are there any controls? Or...
Oh yeah, no, this is all with controls. Sorry. So I think let me move that up. So this is a multi-level model, and I actually have the tables. We could show for simplicity. I'm showing the illustrations, but this is a multi-level model that controls for age, education, party ID of the prime minister, ideology, a left-right scale. Economic performance, whether people think that the economy is doing well or not, and some contextual variables as well, like the age of the prime minister and the years in office. I didn't talk so much about age, but this is something that also kind of fits into kind of a gender stereotype. And older men probably being assumed to be more positively evaluated than older women or older women or younger women, for instance. But you don't see any real differences here on these other indicators. And on empathy, it's surprising that the men are viewed as being more compassionate than the women. So this might reflect, again, it might reflect the fact that maybe female leaders are moving away from the compassion, that they don't want to be perceived as being compassionate because that fits into the gender stereotype. So they might be moving away from that and emphasizing their strength, which might cost them in terms of that double bind hypothesis. So there might be a cost to their popularity, and that's what I do next, is to see what effects these have on popularity. On trust, well, trust, not many. On average, the probability of trusting a leader is very low. Perhaps that's why it's so frequently asked. That generally leaders, and particularly incumbents, aren't perceived as being very trustworthy. Although the exception here is that women tend to see female prime ministers as being more trustworthy. And they're the confidence intervals, so you can kind of see that that these are significant differences. But with men, there's no differences there. On competence, women again are perceived as being more competent than men, which undermines that other assumption that only that competence is a masculine trait or whatever. Okay, I can come back to these as we go along. So now here are the relationships or the effects basically of these traits on popularity. And so again, I've estimated a model. In this case, that's an OLS model, where my dependent variable is the popularity or the likes and dislikes scale, and regressing that on these traits and holding constant respondents' age, education, partisanship, ideology, and so forth. And I think a couple of things are interesting here. You can see that that female prime ministers, regardless of popularity, are perceived as well. Okay, let me back up. They're all positive, right? There's all a very strong positive relationship among all of these traits, but the effects and the slopes are slightly different in that that men who are perceived as being strong leaders are at the same level. Women are a little lower on terms of popularity. That's the expectation, basically. But it's not always the case. So on competence, women generally are higher, regardless of the level of popularity, than men. And then on empathy, there's a bit of a gap there as well. And women are a little bit lower, regardless of the level of empathy, if I'm discussing this correctly. But if the double bind hypothesis were correct, if we wanted to find evidence that was consistent with the gender bind hypothesis, we would see something quite different than this. The double bind hypothesis would predict basically that women who are perceived as being strong leaders would be more disliked, which is not what you see. And similarly, men who are perceived as being compassionate would be more disliked. And it's certainly not moving in that direction at all. So there's really little evidence at all to suggest any evidence at all to support that hypothesis. So these things are strongly related to one another, and they're not moving in opposite directions, if that makes sense. So moving on here, and I think this is one of the most interesting findings and most interesting slides. And what this shows, also I'll kind of walk you through it, is what I did in this sense, in this case, is to estimate country-specific models, where, for instance, in Australia, I pooled the 2010 studies and the 2013 studies together, and then estimated the difference in terms of, I believe this is popularity. I'm missing that. I can't see that. Maybe I can move this. There it is, gender gaps in popularity. I'll move that down. maybe that's blocking everything. So what this is looking at basically is the effect of the difference between men and women on in terms of popularity. And I'm sorry, the difference between male and female respondents in their evaluations of male and female PMs. Okay. So on the left side, what you see is that when the confidence intervals or the estimates are around 0, around that red line, that means that the estimates are not statistically significant, which means basically that there are no differences between men and women in how they evaluate male prime ministers. Okay, so with respect to Kevin Rudd, there's a negative effect, but it's not statistically significant. So you can just assume that there's no gender gap on evaluations of Kevin Rudd. And similarly, there's no difference on Boris Johnson, no difference on Stephen Harper, and so forth and so on. There are some exceptions. Iceland is an exception, and Norway is an exception. So for those two male prime ministers, they benefited from a gender gap where women were more supportive of them than men. But what you see on the right-hand side is that on almost all the evaluations for the female prime ministers, there's a significant gender gap, which reflects the fact that women are much more likely to give positive evaluations to these female prime ministers than men. Okay, so the only exception, there's only one exception, and that's with Finland, interestingly enough. But with all of the other cases, there are significant gender gaps. I think if we ran this with Maloney, that would be another exception. There is no gender gap. There doesn't appear to be any gender gap with her either. And then in some of these cases, the gaps are very large. So there's something going on here with Iceland. We are controlling for ideology as well. And incidentally, the female PM from Iceland was also the first openly gay prime minister in the world as well. But you can see that even with, so what I find interesting is that the effects are clear regardless of whether or not the prime minister is on the right or the left. So you see these gaps with Angela Merkel in both 2017 and 2013, and with other conservative prime ministers like Theresa May or Kim Campbell of Canada. So it's not just a left, it's not easily explained. If you were just looking at Julia Gillard, you think, oh, because she's on the left. And so that's not the case. You see these similar gaps on both sides. But I think this is probably one of the most interesting things about the paper. Okay, moving on. So here I put this up just to show just how this was estimated. And so we're moving on from popularity to show you how sort of estimated a model predicting vote choice. And I've stratified the model for just male prime ministers and female prime ministers, and then pooled them all together. And then there's another model that predicts, that has an interaction between popularity and the gender of the sex of the prime minister. So the results basically, this tests this idea of this gender bias in vote choice. And there is some evidence that, given the negative sign, that when you control for all of these things, popularity, again, I'm controlling for those gender gaps in popularity, and I'm also controlling for some contextual effects like the percent of women in parliament as an indicator how visible women are in politics and how well they do, controlling for whether or not there's a coalition government or not. Generally, when you have a coalition government, the party, the incumbent party, or at least the prime minister's party, is able to escape accountability. And you see evidence to suggest that it's negative as well. Or well, not evidence to suggest that. Evidence to suggest that people are more likely to vote against or to blame the prime minister's party when there is a coalition government. But you see a slight negative effect for female prime ministers, and I'll explain what's going on in a second. There's no evidence also to suggest that that women that the popularity affects women and men differently. So it has the same effect, and it's a very strong effect. Let me show you what's going on with the vote choice with women. And here's these are sort of country-specific estimates, so you can kind of see what's going on. So there's a very strong negative effect in Canada, but there's also a statistically significant effect in Germany and in New Zealand as well, where we have multiple elections. We have multiple elections in Germany and multiple elections in New Zealand, because we've had. The nice thing about New Zealand, and I didn't talk about this much, but there's in this analysis, there are two female prime ministers from the Labour Party, Helen Clark and Jacinda Ardern, and also another female prime minister from the National Party. And I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but it'll come right back to me, who's also in the analysis, paired with other male prime ministers. But so the evidence here is that we've got about 14 elections, Canada, Germany, and New Zealand. Those three countries comprise about 14 elections in the sample, and they're negative. The only place where it's positive is in Norway. So on average, what this produces is a slight negative effect for women. And I mean, we could talk about that too later. So just to kind of summarize, and here's another figure basically that shows the influence of popularity on vote choice. And you can see that it's significant in almost every case. Again, there's that exception with Finland. So something weird is going on with that particular prime minister in Finland. If you recall, she was the only one where there was no gender gap. And in this case, there's no significant effect of her popularity on vote choice. But for the most part, popularity matters, and it has a magnitude. It matters more in some cases than others, but it doesn't matter more for female prime ministers than male prime ministers, if that makes sense. And so just to summarize all of this, if you sort of go through the main findings, I don't think there's much evidence to support the gender stereotype hypotheses, in that, female prime ministers are perceived as being stronger leaders and less empathetic. So it doesn't align with what the literature would predict, and there's no support at all for the double bind hypothesis. There is, I think, a lot of support for the gender affinity hypothesis, that women are generally much more supportive than men when it comes to female prime ministers. And so they appear to be benefiting from this. And there's just a tiny bit of evidence, I think, to suggest that there is a gender bias, that voters might be less likely to vote for parties led by women. And we can talk about the context in which these elections are taking place, but I've tried to control for economic evaluations and these other things where these things do tend to make a big difference. So just the final slides, I mean, in terms of the implications of this, I think they challenge gender stereotypes in the literature. And I think the evidence suggests that that perhaps the gender of a leader matters. particularly in terms of gender affinity. So I think if we sort of predict what's going to happen tomorrow, we already know that there is a substantial gender gap on Kamala Harris, and that gender is playing a big role in the presidential election. And I would expect that if, I think that Kamala might indeed benefit from this, and it might actually make the difference. It'll come down to mobilization, and I think that maybe white men with lower levels of education are probably less likely to vote than women, and that might make the difference in these critical battleground states. But that's what I have. So thank you for tuning in, and if you have any questions, happy to.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we can open the floor. If you have any questions, be it in the room or online. I see that Valentina has a question.
Great. Can I? How do I?
I think it's she.
Oh well, you go ahead and unmute, Valentina.
Or there is something that.
Oh, there we are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Don't hesitate to introduce yourself, Valentina, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Valentina Di Stasio. I'm chair in sociology at the SPS department. I have 3 questions. I also put them in the chat because I wasn't sure whether my audio would be good. So the first one is, so I think it's a very interesting idea to look at leadership perceptions also in relation to political leaders using real examples. And your example of Meloni is particularly interesting to me, not only because I'm Italian and I have followed the discussion about how she comes across as a leader within Italian politics. And this made me think about the role of motherhood status, because you refer to gender stereotypes in general. But one of the points that Meloni often stresses is that not only she's a woman, but she's also a mother. And this is a point that perhaps also serves the purpose of sustaining a political agenda that goes in the direction of gender conservatism. But it's also interesting outside of Italian borders. I'm thinking about Kamala Harris' example once again, of her being considered by some as unfit for office because of not being a mother. So I was wondering about the role of motherhood status. Then I have a question about when exactly are these leadership traits being studied? Because I think you control for years in office, but I was thinking about the literature about gender cliffs and the possible backlash that women leaders can suffer from in case of government crisis. So I'm wondering whether do you have any control for the success of the party in government? And relatedly, whether you consider also the gender of the main party competitor to measure, sort of to measure evaluations in contests, because I think it's quite interesting that you do not find these positive evaluations for Meloni in the sample, in the study where you compare her against Draghi within the same survey, right? So when there was a direct competitor of a different gender. And then finally, my last question, I would like to bring in an intersectional lens that perhaps is less relevant here because I think you only studied white leaders, but because you mentioned at the beginning Kamala Harris, and because of how topical this is an interesting example of a person being both Black and Asian. And for these particular groups, assumptions about the stereotypes about femininity are less strong. And I think this is a particular combination of racial groups because we have, on the one hand, Blacks being considered as high in strength, high in dominance. So perhaps agentic traits are rewarded here. And indeed, Black leaders often suffer less of an agentic backlash. But at the same time, the Asian heritage also brings in more, like stereotypes about high competence. So I'm wondering what would your theory predict here? So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Those are great questions. Let me try to, let me see if I have a picture of these women, the sample here. Most of, it's interesting, the motherhood, I don't talk about this in the paper, but it does come up, and it's definitely an issue for a lot of these women, and it's come up in their political careers and so forth. For instance, I know Julia Gillard, it came up with her, and Helen Clark, not having any children. Jacinda Ardern is interesting because she actually had a child when she was Prime Minister in New Zealand, which attracted a lot of attention and so forth. I don't believe, let's see, I'm trying to, I don't believe Theresa May has had kids either. Jenny Shipley, that's who I was trying to remember as well. There was an issue, and in Iceland as well. So some of these, or many of these women have not had children, and that has been an issue that's come up. I don't know. It's difficult. It's difficult. The whole thing is difficult, right? because with any of these studies of leaders, it's their own individual characteristics that tend to attract a lot of attention, and it's difficult to separate these things and to try to, examine whether or not there's any bias or whatever against one particular individual. And so that's the idea of trying to look at this in a more systematic way than just looking at specific individuals. Maloney's interesting I think she's very interesting because she's specifically has tried to, challenge the stereotype, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she's asked to be referred to in a masculine way. Is that correct? But she also has a child. But she's an interesting outlier, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure if she's an outlier or not. There is an argument, and I've had comments about this, that whatever I'm picking up is a reflection of what the women in particular have done to challenge these existing stereotypes. And I think it's important also, and this is one of the other reasons why I selected prime ministers in particular, because they haven't necessarily had to get elected to be prime ministers. So a lot of these people have assumed leadership roles and become prime ministers outside of and not necessarily being elected. For instance, Julia Gillard, for example, she came to power by basically challenging Kevin Rudd and was accused basically of a coup. She was, she was his deputy prime minister. Kim Campbell of Canada was selected, basically, it's almost like Kamala, a very interesting comparison. She was selected very much at the end of the campaign as kind of a Hail Mary to try to see if the Conservatives could win the election. And of course, she was defeated. And that's, again, one of those cases where she was one of the outliers, if you will. So you asked about the backlash, about when and the context in which these have taken place. And what I've tried to do is to try to model that by controlling for economic evaluations as an indicator of, or to try to control for whether or not the context matters. Because again, the comment, to the extent that you do see these negative relationships, that women tend to do worse, is that they might have been put in these positions because they're a woman, in order to try to rectify a bad situation. So, and I think Kamala fits into that context, that, without saying too much about the presidential election, that you know, if it weren't Donald Trump, I suspect that Kamala would not be as close as she is to winning the presidency, not because she's a woman, but because the context is really hurting the Democratic Party, and the fundamentals hurt her. You asked control for party in government. Sorry, I have a note here. Control for party in government. Valentina,
for the gender of the competitor.
For the gender of the competitor. Oh, yeah, I had that as well. Okay, I didn't do that, and that might be worth looking at. I don't think. I think, yeah, it's difficult with these pairs because the problem with the parliamentary elections is that you don't typically have, that people don't really know much about the leaders, about the party leaders. And that's why I haven't really looked at the opposition leaders. But it's a good comment. And I know in some of these elections that the men were facing female party leaders who are in the opposition. And in some cases, what's interesting is just in this particular example, that Helen Clark and Jenny Shipley actually faced one another in an election. I believe it was in I think it was the 1999 New Zealand election, where Jenny Shipley was the first female prime minister, not elected, and then Helen Clark defeated her in that election. So that's actually a good. I might look at that and have a look at that. Was there something else I didn't ask? Because I have a note here that there was a control for party in government. But maybe that was linked to the.
Was it the number of years in office?
Oh, the years in office, right. Years in office, that's what it was. I think I have that in, well, I can easily cycle through. Years of party in government. Yes, I do control for that in this model. And it has this negative effect, as you would expect. So the longer the party is in government, the lower the vote, the lower the likelihood of voting for the, yeah.
So, okay.
Did I, and I know you put some stuff in the chat. I can have a look and we'll come back and.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you very much. So are there other questions? Yes, please, in the room. Perhaps if you can walk here, it's closer to the micro. I think that we can hear you, or you can even come so that people can see you, actually.
Oh, great.
So I'll just present myself very briefly.
Oh,
Just go.
no, the camera.
Or perhaps you can sit here.
Okay. So my name is Madalena. I'm a first year researcher.
Hi.
So I'm not here to with these methodologies and data collection. So I was just wondering, during our presentation, if you focused, the data you took was from election times, electoral times, or if you also evaluated how popularity changed over their time in office. Because as you said, maybe during electoral times, women might feel the need to go out of their way to showcase more masculine traits, as you said, and maybe hide out the feminine traits or tone them down a little bit. So I was wondering, like, what happens after election time? So what happens during time in office, and these gender stereotypes play a role on how popularity changes. And you also mentioned the example of the Prime Minister of Finland, and that she was seen in a party and how the backlashed a lot. So I was interested.
Yeah, great. I don't have, so what I have here are basically snapshots, or cross-sectional surveys, where respondents were interviewed after the election, right after an election. And, but I do have multiple, I have in some cases, multiple snapshots.
Okay.
And in some cases, multiple snapshots of the same people. So Angela Merkel, for example, standing in multiple elections. Helen Clark, also of New Zealand, standing in these multiple elections. Jacinda Ardern as well. And so to the extent that you can make these comparisons, there is an interesting time component here, and I've had it come up also, and I'm not quite sure how to model it. I don't think there is. There's no evidence that there is any temporal effect. What you would expect there to be, though, because you would expect perhaps gender stereotypes play a bigger role, perhaps when women were not as prominent. And in some of these countries, have had not one female prime minister, not two, but three. I mean, New Zealand's had three. The UK has now had three. I mean, Italy's just had one. But in Norway and Finland had two. So it's becoming increasingly more common. So you would expect, as it becomes more common, perhaps that to play a role in how people react to that. And so I'm still trying to think about that. There are interesting, though, comparisons over time. Jacinda Ardern is one of the most popular prime ministers in the analysis, although she ended up resigning and leaving office, and her party was decimated in the election. Some suspect that she left because she knew that the party was going to be hurt by it. But what was seen initially as a success story with COVID and again, COVID and protecting the country, and that kind of fed into and she used her femininity a lot, and she was seen as being compassionate, particularly after terrorist attacks in Christchurch and in earthquakes and natural disasters in New Zealand, being that sort of compassionate voice. But there is evidence also of a negative backlash against her. And against Sana Marin, they were seen together, for instance, and they were featured together in some coverage, and they were so young, you know, and people were commenting on who are these people, who are these women, or whatever. And Angela Merkel, I mean, there's all this anecdotal evidence that these gender stereotypes and the way in which they're the way in which the media has covered them has fed into these stereotypes. So on the one hand, I would have thought that this would be a conservative test of this theory because you're dealing with people that are very well known. But on the other hand, even people who are extremely well known are being subjected to these gender stereotypes, particularly in the media coverage. I have some discussion in the paper about Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May as well, and how they were being perceived in negative ways. But it could also work in positive ways, as like the Jacinda Ardern and the compassion and that sort of thing. Popularity over time, I only with those snapshots, but the data might exist. I mean, they probably almost certainly exist, which would allow you to sort of see whether or not they lose more support over time. That's an interesting.
If I may have two fingers on that, I think what would be particularly interesting would be to look at those prime ministers before they became prime ministers, right, when they were candidates, because probably what you can have here is a little bit of a survivor bias. These are extremely successful politicians. And the question is, were they perceived as they were at the end of their office, or I mean, when they were running for re-election, were they perceived the same at the beginning of their fame and their political success. I mean, probably you cannot collect it for all the candidates, but if you can collect it for some, this would be extremely interesting. Basically, what power does to those people.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these women like came out of nowhere, right? So like just in there, no one knew her at all. She's extremely young, and she was selected at the last minute to lead the Labour Party, like a month before the election, a month or two before the election, and then they win the election. And you know, similarly, Julia Gillard, no one really knew her that well until she became Prime Minister. Kim Campbell, no one knew Theresa May that much. So I think that's the advantage of not looking at elected people, I guess. I mean, it would. Helen Clark was around as opposition leader. She was an opposition leader, and as I said earlier, she ran against Jenny Shipley in the '99 election. But she was the opposition leader, as was, I think, Angela Merkel was an opposition leader. So she rose to be opposition leader, and then in the subsequent election won as well. But there might be an interesting story there.
Okay, very good. So are there more questions online?
I could call on people. That wouldn't be very fair. But I'd love to hear any other comments. Every time, you know, I presented this various places, and I've said the paper's been under review, and I'm happy to talk about the review process and how challenging it is for something like this. Yeah, it's probably not the best type of paper to write because it's open. There's a lot of potential for criticism, and it's not an easy thing to examine.
But I would say that the findings are definitely fascinating, and
well, I'm glad you.
Yeah, and I guess that a few readers probably expect them. So I think that there is quite some potential to publish it well. But what is, according to you, the most problematic point? Because personally, what comes across here, I guess,
right. I mean, I'm happy to. Yeah, it
would be probably like the choice of the prime ministers and basically of the politicians that you study.
I would have thought I would. So the paper's been under review, and I've got terrific comments, by the way, from, I mean, some, there are a lot of really good academics that give you excellent comments, and particularly in the literature review, most of the comments, believe it or not, have been on the literature and setting up the context and that sort of thing. But there have been other comments about the selection of, and selecting on certain people, and there are arguments that women are, to any extent that you see any kind of negative effect, it's because women have been put in these situations because they're outsiders, and they're often selected when things are not going well. And so to the extent that you see that they don't do well, reinforces that, and I think Kamala kind of fits into that story. She just replaced Biden, and to some extent she benefited from that, but on the other hand, maybe she's suffered from not having an opportunity to campaign for a long period of time. I don't know. Let's see. The experimental people hate this paper. Okay, they really dislike it, and so that's another challenge, because I'm trying to do something different in relying on empirical observational data, and most of the people that work on these questions, particularly the gender stereotypes, it draws a lot from experimental research, and so I tend to when I see comments, you know, that there are often comments made by people who don't like the research design. I had some other comments that well, either they don't agree with it or they do agree with it. You know, it's not really the conclusions. I've had comments that, you know, of course, women are well put together. They're better candidates than men. So why would you expect that they would be a negative? And I answer that. I mean, what's interesting is that that in part, some of this comes out of the motivation for this comes out of a book that was written by some of these female prime ministers, and Julie Gillard in particular, who gave this famous speech in Parliament about misogyny and you know, Australian society being sexist and so forth, and she kind of now is famous for that. And she and others have argued that women are put at such a huge disadvantage, and because they can't win, basically, and they're much more likely to be scrutinized on, you know, what they're wearing, or, you know, whether or not they have children or not, when men are not asked similar questions.
I guess this could also be like a point potentially of criticism, because we are studying like nice countries, you know, developed.
That's the other. Yeah.
In which you have quite strong norms about gender equality, and right, so there could be some desirability bias in those responses. I guess.
Yeah. I mean, in one sense, that I think there's an advantage that I'm looking at countries like some of the Scandinavian countries, that where you would expect egalitarianism, right? You wouldn't expect in Finland there to be a double standard for a female prime minister, and yet you see it there. But I've had people comment on the case selection, yeah. But the problem is I just don't have data from other countries. What would have been great is to have data from Israel, but we just don't have the data for that. There is another possibility of looking at presidents, but I think it complicates it. But there are certainly a lot of cases in South America that you could look at as well. I think there's a lot of opportunity if you're interested in doing something along these lines, or if anyone is interested, I'm happy to talk to you more about it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. So if there is no last minute question, it doesn't seem to be the case. So thank you again. Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending. See you at another event of the interdisciplinary cluster, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you.